and welcome to the Talk They Hear You podcast. What Parents Are Saying, Prevention Wisdom, Authenticity, and Empowerment. This podcast is brought to you by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. Talk They Hear You is a national prevention campaign that aims to help parents and caregivers talk with their kids about the dangers and risks of underage drinking and other drug use. In this podcast, we hear what is working and what isn't, and what might assist in our efforts to help kids navigate away from alcohol and other drugs. I'm Debbie Burnt, Director of Parent Movement 2.0, and I'll be your host. As a reminder, the views expressed here are not necessarily those of SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today, we are talking about brain-based parenting with Dr. Collier. Hi, Dr. Collier. How are you?
Great. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. But before we get started, let me tell our listeners a little bit about you. Dr. Collier has been working with adolescents and adults suffering from mental illness, behavior disorders, and substance abuse since 1991. She has been a professional counselor in the state of Texas since 1999 and a counselor supervisor since 2008. Her areas of expertise includes adolescent brain development, prevention programming, parent coaching, addiction, family of origin work, and training new clinicians. Dr. Collier has created a comprehensive prevention model to teach the neurodevelopmental effects of risky behavior to children, teens, and parents. She has her master's in clinical psychology and doctorate in counselor education. She has received numerous awards and commendations for her work, and in 2019 finished a seminal text called the NeuroWhereAbouts Guide. This book is shedding new light on child development and parenting in particular. Given the extensiveness of her work and how useful brain-based parenting can be for parents, we are getting to dedicate several episodes of the Talk They Hear You, What Parents Are Saying podcast to Dr. Collier and her work. We are honored by Dr. Collier's willingness to share her time with us in this way. So today, in this first discussion, we are covering the building of a brain and what executive function looks like at different ages. So elementary school, middle and high school and beyond. In our second episode, we'll be talking about how to protect that brain and the role of dopamine in human development and something called the hedonic threshold. In our third episode, we'll be talking about tips and tools and techniques of all different kinds that can help parenting. So with that, let's jump in. Dr. Collier, I have had the pleasure of watching and getting to know your work over the last couple years, and you have a pretty amazing personal story that seems to tie to all this work. So can we just start with you telling us a little bit about that and how it relates?
Oh, thank you for asking. I appreciate that. Yes, I always say that what really qualifies me to give this information is that I'm a person in long-term recovery myself. And I started engaging in risky behavior when I was about 12 years old. But I was also a really good kid, followed the rules, didn't give my mom any idea that she should be worried. But then by the time I was 16 years old, I had gotten into some really heavy illicit drugs and started using intravenously for a couple years. Around the time that my parents had gotten a divorce when I was 11, 12 years old, that my mom, my single parent, just didn't have enough time to monitor me in the way that I really needed. And so I got into all kinds of risky stuff. And then I had an overdose when I was 18 years old that, by the grace of God, survived, which is, to me, a miracle because I see so many kids today that are not surviving these horrific overdoses. But I was able to get into rehab. My mom helped me get into a treatment center. So this was back in 1989 when charter hospitals were out in force, and 28 days of treatment was the standard and norm, and it really saved me. Then I went on to a halfway house in Omaha, Nebraska after that, which was a wonderful time in the late 80s, early 90s to get into recovery with a bunch of young people who were trying to do the same. When I got back into school, I started studying everything I could get my hands on about substances because I just couldn't understand why this great, smart good kid made such bad decisions. And so it was also a really great time to study it because all of these really cool brain studies, these functional MRI studies were being published that actually showed us what was going on in the brain while we were engaging in risky behavior. And so I've really devoted my life to studying this topic and empowering parents with the information that they need, and also empowering them emotionally, psychologically, to apply these on a daily basis. Because there are so many temptations out there today, and parents are parenting in a really different world. And so that's really the goal of my guide and my career and what I do.
Every time I hear that story, this fear just washes over me because as a parent, I have 3 kids that are essentially grown at this point. But the idea that one of them at 12 and then at 16 would start using drugs intravenously, it's just beyond comprehension. But the fact is, it does happen. And anything we can know as parents about why that can take off and these incredibly precious children of ours can start making these horrific decisions, and what we can do to either be there to see that it's going on. That's another thing about parenting. Half the time we're so unattuned that we're not seeing some real basic stuff. And then to actually have something we could do to help our families. It's so powerful. Wow. I really appreciate your work. And I am so grateful that you were moved when you were 18 years old after a overdose to figure out what the heck, and then now to share it with all of us.
Most definitely. Yes. I feel very lucky, grateful, and humbled by the ability to be able to be in recovery and do this for a living. It makes me feel really useful.
It's fantastic. So, talk to us about building a brain. What happens? You explain it in a very easy way. So, to help us understand
Okay.
dendrites and
Sure.
myelination
Oh,
and
all
all that
that good
stuff.
stuff. Right. Yes. It's so fun because when I was a kid, the commercial with the fried egg, here's your brain on
Mhm.
drugs came out. And now I actually get to teach kids, here's literally what your brain on drugs looks like with a picture of the brain. And then finding that kids see this as fascinating. Kids love it and it empowers them to want to protect their brain. And so I think it's really important for parents to know this, that you teaching this to your kid is really critical. And so I find a lot of parents today will say to me, well, do I have the power to do that? How can I say no? But isn't everybody doing it? Really almost scared to parent or feeling unempowered to create a family code of rules. And what I always say is that you have scientific justification to be your child's frontal lobe until they grow one of their own. And so let's talk about what that looks like. So
Okay,
it's
exactly.
important for parents to know that the brain grows in 2 phases. So the first phase is from birth up to about puberty. And in that phase, we're growing neurons, our brain's cells. We grow up to 200 billion neurons by the time we're about 11, 12 years old. And it's interesting because we're actually not even we don't even need all of those. We only need about half of those, but we don't really know which kinds or which networks we need. So it's almost like we get this big chunk of clay. And then when we hit puberty, the second phase of brain development kicks in. And in that phase, from about 11, 12, all the way up to about 24, 25, 26, what we're doing is pruning away half of those neurons. So we get rid of 50% of our brain cells. And by the time our brain is fully grown and developed at the age of 24, 25, 26, we have 100 billion roughly neurons left over. And so when I started studying this, I thought, okay, whoa, is it all the drugs I did in high school that killed all my brain cells? Why did I lose all of these? And then I realized, no. Everybody goes through this. And there is a reason for it. So your brain actually needs room for a couple substances to grow. And so the first one is myelin. And if you can imagine a brain cell, you've got this a chunky cell body and the long axon and these tentacle things at the end that kind of look like octopi legs. And so the myelin covers that long axon and it thickens. It's a fatty tissue that insulates the neuron, the brain cell, and the thicker it is, the faster the electrical impulse will move down the cell. Now, that translates to our processing speed, or otherwise known as how quickly we think. So, in that second phase of brain development, we are thickening our myelin, which allows us to think faster and faster and faster. And then the second thing that's growing are my favorite brain structures. That would be dendrites, those octopi things at the end that grow depending upon what we're learning. So dendrites are literally the hardware of learning, which I think is so cool. If you think about every time that you learn something new or practice something, you literally grow another dendrite that reaches out to another neuron, making these long chains and networks of connections for the skills that your brain is engaging in. And so that, of course, takes up space, myelin and dendrites. And so this is why your brain gets rid of half of your neurons so that you can grow these really well-connected networks for the skills that you use. And so what's really important for parents to remember is the rule the brain uses in order to create these connectors. That rule is the use it or lose it rule. And so what that means is the cells that your child is using, whatever skill they're engaging in, that's what their brain will be using, and they will grow long networks of connections for that particular skill. The skills they're not learning, not using, literally those dendrites don't grow for that skill. And so, that seems kind of common sense. Like what you do, you learn, you practice, you get good at, you've got brain structure for. But what a lot of parents don't realize is that the part of the brain that's doing all that growing and developing is primarily our frontal lobe. Our prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that is primarily doing all that thickening and connecting. And so what does the frontal lobe do for us? A lot of people know that our limbic system inside the brain, that old primitive part of our brain, the fight or flight part, we know about that and what that does, especially with all the talk about the stress response and how that leads to anxiety or trauma. But we don't learn a lot about the prefrontal cortex. And I think this is critical for parents to know about, because this is the part of the brain that grows up and becomes a fully functioning, self-supporting adult.
Well, I'm a little hypnotized by the whole story, but okay, let me back up to use it or lose it. When you said that, that made me think about you can speak any language when you're a little kid, and you're born with all of the capacity to do that. And then after, I don't know, 13 or whatever it is, you start losing your ability to learn languages, other languages. Is that something, well, is that true? And is that tied to use it or lose it?
Oh, that's a great example, Debbie. I'm glad that you brought that, because so if you think about that first stage of brain development from birth to about, puberty, around 11, 12, when we're growing 200 billion neurons, we actually get about 90% of those by the time we're 6 or 7.
Okay.
And that's really because we are absorbing so much information, just like sponges. And so if we hear other languages, or if we engage in like playing musical instruments, or if whatever we're engaging in, our brain is going to soak it up like a sponge.
Okay.
And so it's not just language, it's any ability, right? But,
Okay.
we think about learning language as we're learning language, so that's more relevant. But then when we hit that second stage of brain development, use it or lose it is really kicking in. That is how your brain decides which cells to get rid of and which cells to keep. And so if you have absorbed a lot of information for a foreign language or another language, let's just say, then what happens is you now have to use that language, or you will lose the cells that you created for learning it and practicing it. So the example that I use all the time is I was a reader, avid reader when I was a kid. And when my mom became a single parent, she would take me to the library at her university and kind of wink at the librarian. And I would stay in there forever and read and read and read. I wrote book reports in the summer. I was that like geeky kid who did that. And so I developed long neurons in my brain for reading and for writing, which is evident by the fact I wrote a 400-page parent guide, right? But it is infographic style, so it's fun to read. But and now, if you ask me to do math, I have this fear of math because I didn't like math as a kid, so I didn't use those neurons. So my neurons for math are really short, whereas for reading and writing, they're really long and thick.
It's so great to understand that that's a real thing. I guess I worry a little bit in today's world. We as parents can really load up on our kids when they're young and, have them going to a million different classes and doing a million different things. And it sounds like in some ways that's probably warranted, but maybe in other ways, I don't know. I just worry about that might be a little stress inducing as well.
Well, you're spot on in that, I think. And it's important to be able to let parents know that they really need to tune into their child. If their child really loves all those activities, then booking them for a lot of things is great. But if it stresses them out and, maybe they're a slow to warm up temperament and they need to ease into transitions and new things, then they may not be great candidates for enrollment in all of those different activities. It is appropriate, though, because that is the time of brain development when they're really soaking things up like a sponge.
Okay. So I think staying in tune with our children is so key, and it's key again, right? So that never goes away. So let's switch then and spend some more time on this 12 to 25 phase and the growth of the prefrontal cortex. Is it important to understand gray and white matter at this point in time, or should we just kind of focus on that prefrontal development?
Well, I have an easy way to think about gray and white matter. If you think about the dendrites, the connectors, right? That's white matter. If you think about the cell body, that would be gray matter. And so as we grow through the second phase of brain development, we lose gray matter. But it's easier just to think about we're just losing cells, period. We're losing a lot of gray matter. We're adding white matter because we're adding more connectors for the cells that are left over. Okay. I think what's more important for parents to understand is what is actually there that we want to utilize the brain's rule for. And that is building executive functioning skills.
Okay, so talk to us about building executive function skills. Let's talk prefrontal cortex, what that means.
Sure. So if we think about what skills that we want to help our children build long networks for, dendrites for, we think about executive functioning skills. And that just means those are our basic thinking, our basic cognitive skills. And I have a list of the two different categories of skills that grow in phase 1 and phase 2. So I really want to read these out loud so parents can really hear them. From birth to up to age 11, 12, we're really mastering the following executive functioning skills: initiating tasks on our own, shifting from one thing to the next, that's called flexible thinking, planning, prioritizing, organizing, working memory, which is really holding things in your memory to use while you're working on different tasks, self-monitoring or checking how you're doing when you're engaging in a task, paying attention to what the important things are, which is selective attention, and coordination. All those physical things that our body grows and learns how to do, but cognitively, what our brain is growing is that first level of what I like to call the lower level executive functioning skills, which, if you think about a scaffold, it's your first level of scaffolding. That then, the second phase of brain development, we grow a higher level executive functioning skill set, which is the second scaffolding.
I think you should go ahead and tell us what that second scaffolding is as well, so we can kind of get a whole picture of it right now.
Absolutely, definitely. So that second level that we start growing in middle, high school, all the way through college. And of course, we grow these skills for the rest of our lives, but the order in which we grow them is really important for parents to understand. And so once we hit middle school, that second phase of brain development kicks in because puberty lets our brain and our body know we need to start making some changes. And those skills include a really cool higher level of thinking. Abstract, or what we call symbolic thinking, starts to kick in. So we move from being very concrete thinkers when we're young into abstract, more strategic, critical, abstract reasoning, which is much more rational in many ways. Impulse control. Impulse control is a basic executive functioning skill, which, if you've ever seen the Stanford marshmallow experiment, they really have shown that self-control or impulse control is the number one predictor of adult success. And that is really starting to come online during that second phase of brain development. And then, of course, decision making, problem solving, emotion regulation, frustration tolerance. Those are basic executive functioning skills that we really start to hone in and grow in that second phase. And then, of course, resulting in all of that development is hopefully good judgment and empathy, which is, I think, the most important one. Of course, the Stanford experiments would talk about self-control, but I really believe that empathy is one of the most critical human skills we can have, which allow us and give us justification for more self-control or impulse control. But if you think about it, Debbie, you have to have abstract conceptual understanding coming online to really have empathy. Prior to that, you could be a really sensitive kid, but really being able to imagine what else somebody is thinking and feeling, that requires a higher level of thinking.
Right. What someone might feel when you say something, or what their experience might be, that takes imagination. And as you said, imagination is more abstract thinking.
Exactly.
You talk about bullying relative to all this, which I find so fascinating. Explain that to us.
Sure. So, what I wanted to do in my research is graph high risk behavior so that parents knew when it was about to spike, so they knew when to have the conversation with their kids about it. And bullying and cyberbullying were the most interesting ones. So, if you see the graph, which we will have a PDF for you to be able to view it, but it's really interesting. Bullying starts to increase in elementary school and it peaks in 7th grade, and then statistically significantly drops in high school and continues to drop throughout high school and college. Cyberbullying, it's the same exact pattern, but it peaks in the 8th grade, which makes sense because more of our kids are getting cell phones by the time they're in 8th grade. But again, it statistically significantly drops freshman year in high school and continues to drop therefore. That really illustrates the two phases of brain development. That first phase, we don't have a lot of empathy developed yet, and we're very concrete thinkers. So that sets the stage for more bullying and less impulse control, acting out behavior. But then we hit around 11, 12 years old, and that corresponds to about, late middle school, early high school. And that's when empathy really starts to come online. And you see kids realize the consequences of their actions in a deeper, more meaningful way. And therefore, bullying and cyberbullying start to drop.
That's amazing that there is a neurological underpinning for that. Actually gives me great comfort, So, I mean, Like I said, I have 3 kids, and I have had a bully and I've had a recipient of a bully. So I've seen that from both sides, and it's very painful as a parent to navigate and help your child understand what's going on, and especially if you have the bully, to be able to and somehow wrap around them to help them either get to the time of the neurological development or at least understand what's happening. Because again, so much parenting is painful. If we can understand some of it, I just think it helps us all evaluate what we need to do as parents.
Absolutely. And it helps you approach your kids, I think, a different way that empowers them. And
Yeah.
that's why I made up the word NeuroWhereabouts, because I thought, gosh, we got to know where our kids' NeuroWhereabouts are, which means where is my child's brain development right now? What can I expect and what can I not expect? I remember early on as a therapist, parents would come to me and they would say, "Oh my God, is there something wrong with my kid?
Yeah.
Because they're being so mean to someone else, or they're being cruel to me, or they're telling me they hate me for the first time, or, the things that are normal for brain development to come
Right.
along." But when parents don't know what's happening, they don't know that it's really normal. They don't know that kids actually should start arguing more once they hit that second phase of brain development. And that's a good sign,
Right.
because they just may think it's disrespectful and not okay and squash
Right.
it when there's another way to handle it. Knowing your child's neuro whereabouts empowers you with this
Right.
information. Now, it's important, though, going back to the empathy, that you don't have to tolerate a kid who's
Right.
not
Right.
showing empathy, right?
Right.
But
Right.
if you know the brain's rule, use it or lose it, you can start teaching empathy before their brain even has the capacity to get there, because kids are sensitive. And if you ask a child, what do you think that other person is thinking? What do you think that other person is feeling? You're teaching them how to have empathy. And you can do
Awesome.
that from very early on, and then talk about what your family rule is about bullying and how we treat people, and hold kids accountable when they fail to do it that way.
That is awesome. And that I want us to really dive into in our second episode, because we need to spend some really focused time on that brain based parenting and how you signal and give praise and move your children in this direction. So let's stay on the brain for a second. I think the other thing that this neuro whereabouts concept does for parents, when they can start to understand, okay, what is normal for my child, you can start taking it less personal as a parent. We're so connected to these children and we understand them in certain ways that no one else can. But that also makes it really intimate and really personal. And when they do things like bullying, like substance use, like things that are risky, it's so personally impactful. I'd almost, insulting in a certain way to me as a parent. So I think the idea of knowing where they are neurologically so that it doesn't feel like it's reflecting on me so brightly and then can become more effective. I don't know. Thoughts?
I'm listening to you speak, and in my imagination, raising your babies and toddlers and seeing them off to school, and then watching them bully someone else.
Mind
Oh
blowing.
my gosh, right. And you're like, what? And it feels like a personal reflection on your parenting skills. And
Yes.
oh, what's the world going to think? And there's so many social consequences that come to play as far as interpersonal and emotional. I always tell parents that, when I'm coaching you or taking care of your child, I really honor the fear that you have as a parent, because it's not just about your safety for your child, but it's about their hopes, their dreams, their future,
Yeah.
what your relationship's going to look like, how they're going to feel, all of those things.
Right.
So one of the
Yeah.
things that I think is really important to know is, okay, how do I make this more of a transaction rather than a relational issue? Because, like, I was just coaching a parent the other day who, she said, but my kid and I used to sing in the car together on the way to school, and now she just wants to put her earbuds in and not talk to me. And I told her how selfish that was. And I feel really bad because I don't think that's the way that I should have talked to her. But we talked that through, because it does look selfish and self-centered from an adult perspective. But if you look at it from a neurodevelopmental perspective, she's at the age where she's starting to individuate and push away and wanting more privacy and speaking less to parents. And that is one of the most painful parts, when your kid does not want you to hug them in front of school before, when you're letting them out of the car, all those things.
Right.
So being able to deep dive into what I call being a director and then moving into being a trainer. So that first phase of brain development, you're the director. You call the shots, a lot of you statements, you need to, you should, you. But then when our kids hit puberty and they go through that second phase, I recommend that you start to move into a trainer role. And if you think about what a trainer does, a trainer teaches you how to lift a certain weight, and then they're coaching and cheerleading you after that. They don't teach you again and again and again and again. They don't lecture you about those weights, right? They just make sure that you learn how to keep yourself safe. And then they praise you as you use your skills and develop more strength. That's the second phase of brain development, which is less relational and more transactional. You're teaching them how to be a fully self-supporting adult in that phase.
That sounds exciting. And I think we should move to that. So
Okay.
Anything else you would tell us about the ages in which brain capacity comes online, or the development of the brain itself?
Well, I think it's important to remember that you can teach skills at any time, but you really want to focus on what their brain is capable of, what scaffolding they're in. And so if you go through that list of executive functioning skills, think about the things they do well, the things that they're mastering, and then think about the things that they're not maybe doing so well in. So if you've got a younger kid who is not being able to pay attention the way that you'd like, you may want to get a referral for attention deficit assessment. If you've got a kiddo who's really struggling with organization, you may want to figure out how to help strengthen those skills. So focusing on the scaffolding level that they're in and then building on those skills as you go. And that's a great time to transition into what I call brain-based praise, is using that type of language as a trainer to reinforce the skills that your child is already doing well, but also creating a plan to figure out how to improve on the skills that they're not doing so well on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And tune in to the second episode to keep on listening. We want to remind listeners that all Talk They Hear You materials, including this podcast, can be found on the Talk They Hear You website, which is Talk They Hear You, all spelled out, no spaces, .samhsa.gov. SAMHSA is SAMHSA.gov. Please share this site and this podcast with your friends. The more we can be in conversation with each other, the better for everyone, especially our kids. Lastly, we would like to hear from you. Would you like to be on our show? Do you have stories to share, or tips or techniques that have worked or not worked for you as a parent? Do you have questions for us, or any feedback for topics or improvements of any kind? We know that your input will help us design the most useful interviews possible. For this, please contact us at whatparentsaresaying@gmail.com. Again, all spelled out, whatparentsaresaying@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.